Imagine a quiet Baltimore bus, a group of rowdy teenagers, and an elderly man sitting calmly at the front. The teens, led by Jordan Baker in his red hoodie, see an easy target: a man too old, too quiet to fight back. They start with mocking words, laughing loudly as the other passengers pretend not to notice. But what they don't know is that this man, Samuel Henderson, is a Vietnam veteran who has faced far greater challenges than a few taunts on a bus. As their words grow sharper, the air on the bus becomes electric. The teens expect submission, but Samuel doesn't rise to their bait. Instead, he teaches them a lesson about true strength, respect, and resilience, one they'll never forget. Stay until the end to see how this gripping confrontation transforms everyone involved. And remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and move us. During an ordinary weekday commute, Samuel Henderson, an elderly black man, settled into his usual seat on the crowded 5:15 bus bound for downtown Baltimore. The air was thick with the conversations of weary passengers, all eager to reach their destinations. Samuel, dressed in a well-worn jacket and neatly pressed slacks, placed his weathered hands atop a cane as old as he was. His calm and steady gaze scanned the blurred city streets through the window. Few noticed him, and even fewer could guess the life of sacrifice and experience he carried within. It wasn't long before a group of teenagers boarded the bus. Their laughter was loud and unrestrained, echoing through the vehicle as they jostled for seats. Among them was Jordan Baker, a lanky youth with a red hoodie, whose mischievous grin widened when he spotted Samuel. Whispering something to his friends, Jordan's snickers soon spread through the group. They began making snide remarks, mocking Samuel's age and appearance, testing how far they could go. The other passengers, seemingly uneasy, kept to themselves, their heads lowered as if pretending not to hear. Samuel's silence only encouraged the boys. Jordan leaned forward, his tone laced with mockery. "Hey old man," he called out, "lost your walker or something?" The taunts grew sharper, and the teenagers grew bolder, expecting a reaction. But Samuel remained still, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery. His calm demeanor wasn't a sign of weakness, it was a choice. At last, Samuel turned his head slightly, meeting Jordan's gaze with an unflinching stare. His voice, low and firm, broke through the teenagers' laughter. "Respect is a lesson some people only learn the hard way." The simple words carried an unexpected weight, silencing the boys momentarily. Jordan hesitated, his confidence shaken, but his pride refused to let him stop. He leaned closer, throwing out more taunts, but Samuel's quiet strength remained unbroken. As the bus rattled on, Samuel stood slowly, his cane steadying him as he rose. Though age had softened his frame, his presence seemed to fill the space. His voice, calm yet commanding, addressed Jordan directly. "You think strength is loud, don't you?" he asked. "You have no idea what strength really looks like." Samuel's words reflected a lifetime of lessons. 40 years earlier, he had stood in Vietnam's humid jungles, facing challenges and loss that had shaped him into the man he was now. Strength, he explained, wasn't found in mockery or posturing. True strength came from endurance, courage, and quiet dignity. The teenagers' bravado faltered. One of them, Tim Morris, muttered a quiet apology. The other passengers, once silent bystanders, exchanged glances. Samuel's presence had transformed the atmosphere on the bus, shifting it from tense discomfort to thoughtful reflection. Before stepping off at his stop, Samuel left them with a final piece of wisdom: kindness and respect cost you nothing, but withholding them can cost you everything. As the doors closed behind him, his words lingered in the minds of those on board. It wasn't just a bus ride, it was a lesson in humanity and strength. The teenagers watched Samuel return to his seat, their earlier laughter now reduced to nervous silence. Jordan leaned back in his spot, crossing his arms as if to regain some semblance of confidence, but the embarrassment was evident in his tense shoulders. Tim glanced over at him, his voice barely above a whisper, "Man, let's just drop it. The guy's been through stuff." Jordan didn't respond right away. His gaze shifted to the old man, who sat quietly, hands resting on the cane, his expression unreadable. For the first time since they'd boarded the bus, the teen's energy seemed to dissipate. Their boisterous presence, once so dominating, was now overshadowed by an air of awkward introspection. They avoided eye contact with the other passengers and kept their voices low. The weight of Samuel's words had left a mark that neither pride nor bravado could easily erase. A few seats down, an older woman adjusted her scarf and cast a thoughtful glance toward Samuel. She had been among those who had kept silent during the encounter, unsure whether stepping in would help or just make things worse. Now, however, she felt a faint sense of regret. The man's calm strength had reminded her of her own father, a World War II veteran who had taught her about respect and resilience. She wondered why so few had spoken up. Looking around, she could see that others were just as pensive, their faces marked by a kind of collective reflection. Jordan finally muttered, "Whatever," under his breath, but his friends didn't rally behind him as they had before. Tim, still uncomfortable, gave a slight shrug and looked out the window. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a business suit folded his newspaper and cleared his throat. He looked at Samuel and nodded slightly, a small gesture of respect, but one that didn't go unnoticed. As the bus rattled through its usual stops, the ride continued in relative quiet. The other passengers went back to their routines, though many stole occasional glances at Samuel. Some, like the older woman, felt a twinge of admiration for the way he'd handled the situation. Others were still working through their own feelings about what had unfolded. The atmosphere on the bus, once filled with idle chatter and teenage bravado, was now tinged with a quieter, more reflective energy. By the time the bus approached the final downtown stop, the tension that had filled the air earlier had mostly dissipated. When the bus came to a halt, Jordan and his friends shuffled off, their heads low and their voices muted. As they walked down the street, Jordan shot a final glance back at the bus. His friends remained quiet, and for once, he didn't push them to laugh or crack jokes. Instead, he pulled his hoodie tighter around his head and kept walking. Samuel, now sitting alone, leaned back slightly and allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The lesson he'd shared wasn't just for the boys, it was for everyone on that bus. And even though no one applauded or openly praised him, Samuel knew that his words and actions had left a lasting impression. As the doors hissed shut and the bus continued on its route, the older woman gave Samuel a faint nod of approval before turning back to her own thoughts. The moment had passed, but the message lingered. As the bus rolled on, Samuel adjusted his cane and sat a bit straighter, his calm composure unwavering. The tension had faded, but the memory of what just happened stayed with the passengers. Several glanced at Samuel with a newfound respect. He didn't say anything further, but his steady presence left an impression. One of the younger passengers, a college student named Emily who had been quiet during the commotion, finally spoke up. "Excuse me, sir," she said hesitantly. "I just wanted to say, I think you handled that really well." She smiled nervously, her voice carrying the warmth of sincerity. Samuel nodded slightly, his weathered face showing just the faintest trace of a smile. "Thank you," he replied, his voice calm and deliberate. Across the aisle, Tim Morris kept his eyes on the floor. Jordan Baker, who had been so confident earlier, fidgeted uncomfortably. His posture slouched, and he avoided looking in Samuel's direction. Whatever pride he had felt from entertaining his friends earlier was now replaced by something heavier, perhaps embarrassment, or even regret. Near the front, the older woman who had adjusted her scarf earlier seemed deep in thought. She looked at Samuel again, as if summoning the courage to speak. Finally, she leaned forward. "You know," she began, her voice steady but thoughtful, "it's not every day you see someone stand up to that kind of behavior without raising their voice." She glanced at the group of teenagers who were now much quieter. You gave them something to think about. I think you gave all of us something to think about. Samuel nodded again, his expression thoughtful. Sometimes, he said, it's not about what you say, but how you say it. People don't learn from being shouted down. They learn when they have to face their own actions. Jordan shifted in his seat, glancing toward the front of the bus. He was no longer the brash teenager looking for a laugh. Instead, he seemed more subdued, lost in thought. Tim nudged him lightly, whispering something that the other passengers couldn't hear. Jordan didn't reply. Instead, he sank further into his seat, arms crossed, eyes focused somewhere far off. Emily, the college student, leaned back in her seat, a small smile playing on her lips. She pulled out her phone, not to scroll through social media, but to jot down a few thoughts. She wanted to remember this moment. It wasn't often that she saw someone handle a difficult situation with such grace. The bus continued its route, and the atmosphere remained calm yet reflective. The passengers were quieter now, their earlier chatter replaced by an unspoken understanding. Samuel gazed out the window, the city streets passing by, his mind seemingly elsewhere. The lesson he'd given wasn't just for the teenagers. It was for everyone about respect, dignity, and the strength it takes to stand firm without causing harm. When the bus finally reached Samuel's stop, he rose slowly, cane in hand. He moved with the same quiet dignity he had carried throughout the ride. As he made his way to the door, a few passengers gave him small nods of acknowledgement. Even Jordan, sitting near the back, watched him leave without a word. The teenagers stayed behind as Samuel stepped off the bus. Outside, the early evening light bathed the city streets in a soft glow. Samuel adjusted his jacket and began walking, his steps deliberate and steady. The moment on the bus was behind him, but its impact would linger. For the passengers still on board, and especially for those young men who had been so quick to mock, Samuel's words and his actions had left a mark. As the bus pulled away, the quiet within it was not just silence. It was understanding. When Samuel stepped off the bus, the city streets welcomed him with the familiar sounds of traffic and the faint rustle of leaves carried by the breeze. He didn't hurry. His cane tapped steadily against the pavement as he made his way toward the small row house he had called home for decades. The bus doors closed behind him, but the lesson he had imparted lingered inside. The teenagers, still subdued, stared at the floor or out the windows, while the other passengers quietly reflected on what they'd witnessed. Jordan Baker, his red hoodie drawn tightly over his head, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Tim Morris gave him a nudge. "You okay, man?" Tim asked softly. Jordan didn't respond right away. His hands were stuffed deep into his pockets, and his once confident smirk was gone. Finally, he muttered, "I didn't think he'd say all that." Tim nodded. "Yeah, me neither. But he's got a point, you know." The boys fell silent again, each mulling over their own thoughts. They had come onto that bus looking for fun, for a target, for something to break up the monotony of the day. They hadn't expected to walk away feeling small, exposed, and, most of all, unsure about themselves. At the front of the bus, Emily glanced over her notes on her phone. Her fingers hovered above the screen as she thought about what Samuel had said. She typed a line, "Strength isn't loud. It's calm, steady, and earned." She saved the note and locked her phone, deciding that tonight she'd call her grandfather. He'd served in Korea, but he rarely talked about it. For the first time, Emily felt she had a reason to ask him more about his experiences, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. The older woman with the scarf, who had watched Samuel leave, crossed her arms and leaned back. She thought of her son, who was about the same age as Jordan. She couldn't help but wonder how he would have acted in that situation. Maybe he'd have been kinder. Maybe not. She resolved to have a conversation with him about respect, dignity, and how the small moments like that bus ride could leave a lasting impression. As the bus continued its route, the other passengers gradually returned to their own lives. But a subtle change had occurred. When the bus reached its final stop, the teenagers disembarked quietly, their usual banter absent. Jordan trailed behind his friends, his shoulders hunched as if weighed down by more than just his backpack. He glanced once more at the bus before disappearing down the sidewalk. Back at his row house, Samuel eased into his favorite chair. The cane leaned against the wall nearby. He picked up the newspaper from the coffee table, though he didn't open it right away. Instead, he sat back, closed his eyes, and allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. It wasn't the first time he'd had to teach someone the meaning of respect, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that the lesson was out there, planted in their minds. In the days that followed, the events on the bus didn't make headlines. No cameras had captured the moment. No viral video recounted Samuel's words. But the people who were there, the teenagers, the passengers, the bus driver, carried that moment forward. They shared it, piece by piece, with friends, with family, with anyone who'd listen. In a world full of noise, Samuel's quiet strength left its mark, one person at a time. The day after the confrontation on the bus, Samuel followed his usual routine, walking a few blocks to a local diner where he often stopped for breakfast. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. The place was bustling, with the soft hum of conversation and the occasional clatter of plates echoing through the cozy space. Samuel nodded at a waitress who knew his order by heart. "The usual, Mr. Henderson?" she asked with a warm smile. Samuel responded with a quiet "yes, please," and took a seat at the counter. Nearby, Emily sat at a corner table, her laptop open in front of her. She had come here to work on a paper for school, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the bus ride. When Samuel walked in, she noticed him right away and hesitated for a moment before approaching. "Mr. Henderson," she said tentatively as he unfolded a newspaper. Samuel glanced up, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Yes. I don't mean to bother you," Emily said, fidgeting slightly. "I just wanted to thank you again for what you said yesterday on the bus. I've been thinking about it a lot, and, well, it really made me reflect on things." Samuel's expression softened. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied, his voice steady and sincere. "Sometimes the right words can make a difference." Encouraged by his response, Emily pulled up a stool beside him. "It's just that, these days, it feels like people don't listen to each other much. Everyone's so quick to react, to lash out, but what you did, it was different. It wasn't about yelling or making a scene. You showed a different kind of strength." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Strength doesn't have to be loud, Emily. It's about holding your ground, speaking the truth, and doing what's right, even when it's easier to stay silent." Their conversation was briefly interrupted as the waitress set down Samuel's plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and sausage. Emily looked at the food and hesitated before asking, "May I sit with you for a bit? I'd like to hear more, if you don't mind." Samuel gestured to the seat next to him. "Sure. I don't mind at all." As they talked, Emily found herself inspired by Samuel's experiences and his perspective on life. He didn't lecture or try to impress her with grandiose statements. Instead, he shared simple truths learned over a lifetime about respect, resilience, and the importance of treating people with dignity. In return, Emily shared how she had spoken to her grandfather after the bus ride, asking him about his time in Korea and the challenges he had faced. She told Samuel that their conversation had brought them closer, something she never expected to happen. When their conversation came to an end, Emily thanked Samuel once more before returning to her laptop. She felt a renewed sense of purpose and a stronger connection to her own family's history. Samuel, in turn, finished his breakfast and left the diner, his cane tapping steadily on the sidewalk as he made his way home. The encounter, like the one on the bus, was another quiet moment that would ripple outward, reminding people that a steady voice, guided by wisdom and compassion, can leave a lasting mark in an often noisy world. A few days later, Samuel's walk to the grocery store brought him past a local park. The morning sunlight filtered through the trees, highlighting patches of grass where children played and joggers passed by. It was a quiet, familiar route for Samuel, one he often enjoyed for its serenity. But today, as he approached the entrance, he noticed Jordan Baker sitting alone on a bench. The red hoodie that had been pulled up over his head on the bus now lay draped across his lap. Jordan's usual swagger was absent. Instead, his shoulders slumped forward, and he stared down at his hands. Samuel's first instinct was to continue walking. He wasn't one to chase after people, especially those who weren't ready to listen. But something about Jordan's posture made him pause. The boy looked different now, less brash, more thoughtful. Taking a deep breath, Samuel adjusted his cane and approached the bench. "Mind if I sit down?" he asked, his voice steady. Jordan glanced up, his eyes widening briefly before he nodded. "Sure," he mumbled, scooting over slightly to make room. Samuel lowered himself onto the bench, letting the silence linger for a moment before speaking. "Nice morning," he said, watching the kids playing tag in the distance. Jordan shrugged. "I guess." He shifted in his seat, fidgeting with the edge of his hoodie. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said the other day. On the bus." Samuel turned his head slightly, his expression calm but attentive. "What's on your mind?" Jordan hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "I guess I never really thought about respect like that. Or strength. It's just, you know, where I'm from, people act tough because they have to. Because if you don't, someone will walk all over you." He looked down again, his voice quieter now. "But the way you handled it, staying calm and all, it just felt different. Like you knew something I didn't." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Life teaches you lessons, sometimes hard ones. I've been through my share of tough times. But what I've learned is this: real strength isn't about how loud you can be, or how many people you can intimidate. It's about standing firm, knowing who you are, and treating others with respect, even when they don't treat you the same." Jordan listened, his fidgeting slowing as he absorbed the words. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I guess I never really thought of it that way. I mean, I've been acting like, well, like an idiot. Especially with my friends. It's just, they expect me to act a certain way, you know." Samuel offered a small smile. "It's hard to break out of what's expected. But every choice you make, no matter how small, shapes the person you become. You don't have to prove yourself by tearing others down. The strongest thing you can do is be true to yourself, even if it means going against the crowd." The two sat in silence for a while, watching the park come to life as more people arrived. Jordan finally looked at Samuel and said, "Thanks. I mean it. For what you said on the bus, and for talking to me now." Samuel nodded. "You're welcome. Remember, change doesn't happen all at once. It's one step at a time." As Jordan stood to leave, he offered Samuel a small, tentative smile. "Maybe I'll see you around," he said. Samuel tipped his head in acknowledgement. "Maybe you will." As Jordan walked away, Samuel felt a quiet satisfaction. He hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson, but he knew that sometimes, the right words at the right time could plant a seed of change. And as he sat there, cane resting against the bench, he realized that even in small, unplanned moments, there was always an opportunity to make a difference. As the weeks passed, Jordan found himself reflecting more often on his encounters with Samuel. The man's calm demeanor and thoughtful words had stuck with him in a way that no lecture or punishment ever had. Jordan didn't tell anyone, but he started making small changes in his behavior. He tried to stay out of trouble at school, to keep his head down when things got heated among his friends, and even began helping out around his grandmother's house. It wasn't easy, and he slipped up more than once, but each time he did, Samuel's voice seemed to echo in his mind, "Strength isn't loud. It's about doing what's right, even when no one's watching." One day after school, Jordan walked by the park where he had last spoken with Samuel. He half hoped, half expected to see the older man sitting on the same bench, but it was empty. The children were still there, playing tag under the trees, and the sun was setting just as it had that evening weeks ago. Jordan stood for a moment, watching the scene. Then he shook his head and kept walking. He didn't need Samuel to be there this time. He could hear the lesson just fine on his own. Meanwhile, Samuel continued his routine, his days largely unchanged. He still walked to the grocery store, stopped by the diner, and occasionally strolled through the park. He didn't know how much of an impact he had made on Jordan. All he knew was that he had spoken his truth. If it helped, that was enough. At the diner one morning, Samuel ran into Emily again. She was sitting at a corner table, typing away on her laptop. When she saw him, she waved him over. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," she said, her face lighting up. "I was hoping I'd see you again. I've been writing about what you said on the bus. It really got me thinking about the kind of stories we don't hear often enough." Samuel raised an eyebrow as he sat down across from her. "Stories we don't hear?" "Yes," Emily said. "Stories about everyday strength. About people doing the right thing quietly, without asking for recognition. We're surrounded by so much noise, so many people shouting to be heard. But what you did on that bus, that's the kind of story I think more people need to know." Samuel smiled faintly. "It wasn't much of a story. I just said what needed to be said." Emily shook her head. "It was more than that. You didn't just stop those kids from disrespecting you. You showed everyone on that bus that there's a better way to handle things. I know I'll never forget it." Samuel didn't reply right away. Instead, he picked up his coffee and took a slow sip, his gaze thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice was as calm and steady as ever. "Sometimes all it takes is a quiet word at the right moment. The rest is up to them." As Emily nodded, her fingers returning to the keyboard, Samuel's mind wandered to Jordan. He hadn't seen the boy since their talk at the park, but he hoped the message had taken root. Samuel knew that real change, whether in a young man like Jordan or in anyone, rarely came all at once. It was a gradual process, a series of small steps toward a better version of oneself. Later that day, as Samuel made his way back home, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He didn't need to see the results of every conversation or know that every lesson had landed. The important thing was that he had spoken up. He had done his part. And that, Samuel thought, was more than enough. The story of Samuel Henderson teaches us that true strength is not measured by how loud or forceful we can be, but by the quiet resilience and integrity we carry within. In our lives, we may face moments when others test our patience, our dignity, or our resolve. Samuel's actions remind us that we don't have to respond with anger or aggression. Instead, a calm and thoughtful approach can diffuse tension, shift perspectives, and leave a lasting impact. This lesson is especially valuable as we grow older. Our experiences, struggles, and triumphs have shaped us into individuals who can lead by example. When faced with disrespect or unkindness, we have the power to show grace and wisdom. By doing so, we not only preserve our own peace of mind, but we also inspire others, sometimes even those who seem least likely to listen, to consider a better path. Samuel's story encourages us to speak up when it matters, to remain steady in the face of adversity, and to recognize that every interaction holds the potential to teach, to heal, and to strengthen the community around us. If this story resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your own experiences or reflections on what true strength and respect mean to you in the comments. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the heart and inspire deeper understanding. By joining our community, you help keep these lessons alive, spreading respect, kindness, and the power of quiet strength.